The room was filled with polished laughter, crystal glasses, and conversations that sounded effortless. Beneath the warm lights of the charity gala in downtown Seattle, Adrian Mercer stood at the center of it all. He wore the same calm expression that had helped him build an empire few people truly understood. His tailored black suit was flawless. His watch rested perfectly against his wrist before he greeted another investor. He adjusted it out of habit, as though every second of his life belonged exactly where he intended. Claire Whitmore stood only a few feet away. She was elegant in a simple navy evening dress that reflected none of the luxury surrounding her. Hours earlier, she had finished a long shift as a trauma surgeon. She was saving strangers whose names she might never hear again. She had come because Adrian asked her to attend. He rarely asked for anything twice. A guest smiled and raised a glass toward them. "You have built quite a life together," the man said with genuine admiration. "Success like this is easier when you marry for love." Several people chuckled softly. Adrian answered before Claire could even smile. He laughed once casually, as though the thought itself were amusing. "If love were real," he said, swirling the amber drink in his hand, "I would have chosen someone else." The words landed without warning for a heartbeat. No one moved. Someone forced an awkward laugh. Another guest looked away, pretending to notice something across the ballroom. Adrian accepted another handshake. He was unaware that the sentence had already begun changing everything around him. Claire looked at him quietly. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no accusation, and no tears demanding attention. She simply held his gaze for one brief moment, then turned away without a single word. She thanked the hostess for the evening, collected her coat, and walked through the revolving doors into the cool Seattle night. The city lights reflected across the wet pavement after a light rain. The distant sound of ambulance sirens blended into the evening traffic. She drove home alone with both hands resting steadily on the steering wheel. When she entered the house, she moved through each room with the same calm precision she used inside an operating room. Adrian's study remained untouched. His files stayed exactly where he had left them. On the kitchen counter sat a clean ceramic mug. She usually filled it with hot tea before midnight whenever he worked late. She looked at it for a moment, then quietly placed it back inside the cabinet. There was no dramatic decision, no declaration, and no packed suitcase waiting beside the front door. Upstairs, the guest bedroom remained empty. Their wedding photographs still stood in the hallway, unchanged. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet something invisible had already disappeared. Near midnight, Adrian returned home after finishing another business conversation in the parking lot. He loosened his tie as he entered the silent house. The lights were off except for a lamp beside the staircase. He barely noticed the missing cup on his desk. He assumed Claire had gone to sleep early after another exhausting shift at the hospital. Without thinking, he adjusted his watch once more before opening the meeting schedule for the next day. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the windows. Upstairs, Claire lay awake, staring into the darkness without resentment. She had no desire for revenge, and without a single expectation that tomorrow would somehow erase what had been said. Neither of them understood that the most painful wounds rarely announce themselves with raised voices. Sometimes they arrived quietly, hidden inside one careless sentence. That sentence continued echoing long after the room itself had fallen silent. Morning arrived with the same gray sky that often settled over Seattle. But inside the Mercer residence, something almost impossible to notice had quietly changed. Adrian came downstairs before sunrise, already dressed for another day of meetings. His routine rarely varied. He stopped in the kitchen, expecting to find a steaming mug. It usually waited beside the neatly folded financial reports he reviewed over breakfast. Instead, the marble countertop was empty, except for a bowl of fresh fruit and the newspaper resting exactly where the housekeeper had left it. He hesitated for only a second before pouring himself black coffee. The taste was stronger than he preferred. He dismissed the thought almost immediately. Upstairs, Claire was fastening the final button of her white medical coat. She tied her long hair back with practiced movements. She slipped her wedding ring into place as she always had, and quietly left the bedroom without waking Adrian. At the hospital, The pace never allowed room for personal sorrow. A trauma patient arrived just after 7 o'clock, followed by another emergency less than an hour later. Claire moved confidently between operating rooms. She spoke with calm precision that reassured every nurse and resident working beside her. Dr. Naomi Foster noticed the faint exhaustion beneath her friend's composed expression during a brief coffee break. "You look like you barely slept," Naomi said gently. Claire offered a small smile. It was a long evening, nothing more. She returned to her patients before another question could be asked. Across the city, Adrian spent the morning negotiating contracts with international partners. He adjusted his watch before every presentation, just as he always did. The numbers were promising. His executives congratulated him after a successful meeting. Yet something felt strangely unsettled. Around noon, he reached for his phone out of habit. He expected the brief message Claire often sent between surgeries, reminding him not to skip lunch. The screen remained empty. He assumed she had simply been busy. Back at home that evening, Claire arrived first. She prepared a simple dinner for herself, washed the dishes, and placed everything neatly back into the cabinets. Adrian's favorite meal had once appeared every Thursday, without either of them discussing it. Tonight, there was only one plate on the table. When headlights swept across the driveway nearly 2 hours later, she had already changed into comfortable clothes and was reading quietly in the living room. Adrian entered carrying another stack of documents. "Long day?" he asked without looking up from the folder in his hand. "Very," Claire answered. Her voice remained warm, neither cold nor inviting. He nodded and walked toward his study. Normally, she would have followed with a cup of tea a few minutes later. She would place it silently beside his computer before returning upstairs. The hallway stayed empty. Hours passed before Adrian finally leaned back from his desk, rubbing his tired eyes. He glanced toward the doorway, almost expecting to hear soft footsteps approaching. Nothing came except the distant sound of rain against the windows. He walked into the kitchen and opened the cabinet where the ceramic mugs were stored. For a brief moment, he stared at them, without understanding why that simple action felt unfamiliar. He prepared the tea himself, carrying it back to his office. It cooled untouched beside the keyboard while he reviewed the schedule for tomorrow. Upstairs, Claire folded a blanket that had been draped across the sofa since winter and placed it inside the closet. She noticed countless ordinary things that had once connected their evenings together. None of them required anger to disappear. They simply no longer existed. Before turning off the lights, she paused outside Adrian's study. Through the slightly open door, she saw him working beneath the soft desk lamp. He was completely absorbed in reports and deadlines. She quietly closed the door without interrupting him. Inside, Adrian never realized she had been there. He only noticed that the house had become unusually silent. And for the first time in many years, the silence lingered long after midnight. It settled between them like an unseen guest neither of them had invited. 3 weeks passed almost without announcement. They were measured less by calendar pages than by the quiet disappearance of ordinary routines. Adrian still left the house before sunrise and returned long after dusk. He was convinced that discipline could solve nearly every problem life presented. Yet each evening, another familiar detail was missing. The fresh flowers that had quietly appeared in the foyer every Monday were gone. The soft music Claire sometimes played while reading had fallen silent. Even the warm porch light she always switched on before he arrived home remained dark. It stayed that way until a motion sensor awakened it at the last second. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nothing demanded an explanation. Still, the house no longer welcomed him the way it once had. Claire continued living with the same steady grace that had always defined her. She spoke politely. She asked whether he had eaten if their paths crossed in the kitchen. She wished him a safe day before leaving for the hospital. Her kindness remained untouched, but it no longer reached beyond simple courtesy. At Harborview Medical Center, her colleagues admired her quiet confidence. She used it to guide younger surgeons through difficult cases. During one particularly exhausting shift, a teenage patient squeezed her hand before being taken into recovery. "Thank you for staying," the girl's mother whispered through relieved tears. Claire smiled gently. She accepted the gratitude with the same humility she carried into every operating room. Naomi watched the exchange from across the hallway. Later, while they shared a brief lunch between emergencies, she studied her friend carefully. "You're giving everyone exactly what they need," Naomi said softly. "Just don't forget you deserve the same." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "I am learning that." She offered nothing more. Across town, Adrian's days grew increasingly successful on paper. Investors approved a major expansion. His executive team celebrated another profitable quarter. Ethan Brooks congratulated him after an important negotiation ended ahead of schedule. Adrian acknowledged the praise with a quiet nod. He adjusted his watch as he always did before walking into another meeting. Yet, he caught himself glancing at his phone more often than before. Claire's messages had once appeared naturally throughout the day. They were a reminder to eat lunch, a photograph of the sunset outside the hospital, or a simple question asking whether he would be home for dinner. Now, the screen stayed empty unless practical matters required an answer. He told himself she was simply busy. The explanation sounded reasonable, though it became harder to believe each passing week. One Friday evening, Adrian arrived home earlier than expected after a client postponed dinner. The house was peaceful. He found Claire in the sunroom. She was reading beside the rain-speckled windows with a blanket folded neatly across her lap. For a moment, he simply watched her. She seemed completely at ease, as though she had learned to build a quiet life. It no longer depended on whether he walked through the front door. "I didn't know you were home," he said. Claire looked up from her book and smiled politely. The hospital was quieter today. He nodded, waiting for the conversation to continue the way it once would have. It did not. After a few seconds, she returned to her book. It was not out of disrespect, but because there was genuinely nothing more she expected from the moment. Adrian stood there longer than necessary before quietly walking away. Later that night, he entered his study, carrying another stack of contracts. As he reached for a pen, he noticed the corner of the desk where Claire had always left his evening tea. The polished wood was perfectly clean. He prepared the drink himself, then sat without opening a single document. The silence around him no longer felt temporary. It felt established, as though it had settled into the walls of the house. Upstairs, Claire folded the hospital schedule for tomorrow into her leather planner. She placed it beside the bed before turning off the lamp. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the closed bedroom door. Once she would have waited to hear Adrian's footsteps in the hallway before falling asleep. Tonight, she simply switched off the light. In another room, Adrian remained awake long after midnight. He stared at the untouched cup, slowly losing its warmth. He was unable to explain why the absence of one small habit had begun to weigh more heavily than any victory he had earned that month. Another month slipped quietly into their lives. The distance between Adrian and Claire no longer felt like the aftermath of a single painful evening. It had become the rhythm of the house itself. Every morning they crossed paths with gentle courtesy. Every evening they occupied the same home while living in entirely different worlds. One Saturday, Adrian opened a closet in search of an old travel case before an unexpected business flight. Tucked neatly on the highest shelf was a small photo album. He hesitated before opening it. The first photograph showed a younger Claire laughing beneath the autumn trees during their first year of marriage. In another, she stood in their kitchen wearing one of his oversized sweaters. She was stirring soup with one hand and pointing at him with the wooden spoon. She was pretending to scold him for answering work calls during dinner. Adrian could almost hear the laughter that had once filled the room. Without realizing it, he smiled. Then his eyes lifted from the photographs to the silent kitchen outside the study door. The room looked identical, yet somehow nothing inside it felt the same. At the hospital that afternoon, Claire completed another successful surgery after several difficult hours in the operating room. As she removed her gloves, a young resident admitted, "I don't know how you stay so calm through all of this." Claire paused before answering. "People need someone steady on their hardest days." The words came naturally. But as she walked toward the staff lounge, she quietly wondered when she had stopped expecting the same kind of steadiness in her own life. Naomi joined her with 2 cups of coffee. They sat beside a window overlooking the gray Seattle skyline. "Have you thought about taking a few vacation days?" Naomi asked. Claire looked outside as rain slowly traced lines across the glass. "Maybe one day." Naomi nodded. She understood that the answer had little to do with work. That evening, Adrian returned earlier than usual. He was carrying a small bakery box from a shop Claire had once mentioned liking after weekend shifts. He placed it carefully on the kitchen counter before changing clothes. For several minutes he considered knocking on the bedroom door, but an incoming business call interrupted him. By the time the conversation ended nearly an hour later, Claire had already eaten a light dinner and gone upstairs. She needed to prepare for another early morning at the hospital. The untouched pastries remained exactly where he had left them. The following morning, Claire noticed the box while making breakfast. She recognized the bakery immediately. Months ago, she would have been delighted by such an unexpected gesture. She opened the lid, smiled faintly, and placed 2 pastries on separate plates. She left one on the counter with a handwritten note. It simply read, "Thank you. I hope your meeting goes well today." There was no heart drawn beside her name as she once would have done. There was no playful message asking him to save one for later. Adrian found the note after she had already left. He read it twice before folding it carefully and slipping it into his wallet. He did not fully understand why he could not throw it away. Later that week, Ethan accompanied Adrian after another executive meeting. As they walked through the nearly empty office, Ethan glanced toward the family photograph standing beside Adrian's desk. "Is Mrs. Mercer still working impossible hours?" he asked casually. Adrian answered with a quiet nod. "She always has." Ethan smiled. "She must be remarkable. Most people couldn't do what she does every day." Adrian looked toward the photograph again. Claire's smile in the picture seemed effortlessly alive. It was untouched by the careful distance that now defined every conversation between them. For the first time, he found himself wondering not what had changed inside his home. He wondered, when he had stopped noticing, the woman who had quietly carried so much without ever asking to be seen. That question followed him all the way home, lingering in the silence long after the front door closed behind him. The question refused to leave Adrian's mind. It followed him through conference rooms, echoed between polished office walls, and lingered during every quiet drive home beneath Seattle's gray skies. He could no longer dismiss the silence inside his house as a passing mood. It had become evidence of something he had failed to notice until it was almost gone. One evening after another successful board meeting, he returned home earlier than usual. The lights in the living room were dim, and the house carried the comforting scent of fresh linen instead of dinner. Claire had already left for an overnight trauma rotation. Her coat was gone from the hallway. The familiar space by the front door where she always left her hospital bag stood empty. Adrian loosened his tie and wandered through the house without any real destination. For years, every room had existed in perfect order because Claire quietly cared for details no one else saw. Now those same rooms felt less like a home and more like a beautifully maintained building. He stopped outside a small cabinet near the dining room that he had not opened in years. Inside were neatly arranged notebooks, greeting cards, and small keepsakes collected throughout their marriage. Most were organized with the same careful handwriting he recognized instantly. Curiosity led him to lift a slim notebook resting near the back. It was not a diary. It contained nothing deeply personal, only simple lists written over the years. Favorite meals before important meetings, dates of his annual medical checkups, and gift ideas for Ethan's children after hearing Adrian mention them once. It also had flight numbers, coffee preferences for visiting business partners, and the anniversary of the day his company had officially opened its headquarters. Ordinary details recorded because someone had believed they mattered. Adrian slowly turned another page. A short note written months earlier caught his attention. It said to remember to leave the tea warmer on during winter. He forgets to drink it before it gets cold. But there was no complaint beside the sentence. There was no expectation of gratitude, only quiet consideration. He closed the notebook, but kept his hand resting on the cover. For the first time, he realized that countless parts of his daily life had never happened by accident. They had happened because Claire had been paying attention while he had been looking somewhere else. Late that night, he walked into his study carrying the notebook instead of another contract. His desk lamp illuminated the untouched cup of tea he had prepared himself earlier. It was cold again. He looked toward the empty doorway where Claire had once appeared almost every evening without interrupting his work. The memory felt painfully ordinary, and somehow that made it worse. At the hospital, Claire moved steadily through another demanding shift. An elderly patient recovering from surgery asked whether she ever became tired after spending so many hours caring for strangers. Claire smiled gently while adjusting the blanket over his shoulders. "Everyone gets tired," she answered. "The important thing is making sure people don't feel alone while they're healing." After finishing her rounds, she stood quietly outside a patient room, watching a family gather around a recovering father. Their relief filled the hallway with quiet laughter. Naomi approached beside her. "You always stop for moments like this," she observed. Claire nodded. Sometimes recovery begins long before anyone leaves the hospital. As dawn approached, Adrian remained awake in the study. He opened the notebook once more, reading page after page of small acts of care. They had quietly shaped his life without ever asking for recognition. None of them mentioned sacrifices. None demanded appreciation. They simply existed because Claire had loved him in ways too ordinary to attract attention. Sitting alone beneath the soft glow of the desk lamp, Adrian finally understood that the sentence he had spoken at the gala had not only wounded his wife. It had dismissed years of invisible devotion that he had accepted so completely. He had mistaken it for something that required no gratitude at all. For the first time since that evening, he whispered a single sentence into the empty room. "What have I done?" The house offered no answer. There was only the familiar silence that now sounded less like absence and more like the consequence of a truth he had been too proud to see. The next morning, Adrian did something Ethan had never seen in more than a decade of working beside him. He canceled the first meeting on his calendar. There was no explanation and no replacement. He simply looked at the neatly arranged schedule and removed one appointment after another until the afternoon remained almost empty. Then he closed the tablet. Ethan glanced at him with quiet surprise, but asked no questions. Adrian adjusted his watch as he always did. Yet this time, the familiar gesture felt less like confidence and more like a habit searching for its purpose. Instead of driving directly to headquarters, he stopped at a neighborhood grocery store a few blocks from their home. He walked the aisles, slowly, uncertain of what he was looking for. Then he noticed fresh tea leaves arranged beside a display of ceramic mugs. Months earlier, he would never have known which blend Claire preferred. Now he remembered seeing the same pale green package tucked inside their kitchen cabinet countless times without truly noticing it. He placed it carefully into his basket. At Harborview Medical Center, Claire finished another demanding morning in surgery before stepping into the staff lounge for a brief moment of silence. She poured herself coffee, opened a patient chart, and reviewed notes with the same quiet focus she gave every responsibility. Naomi entered carrying a stack of files and smiled gently. "You actually took your lunch break today," she teased. Claire returned the smile. "I'm trying to keep at least one promise to myself." Naomi nodded approvingly. It was a small sentence, yet it carried more strength than sadness. Back at the Mercer residence, Adrian stood alone in the kitchen. He searched through drawers until he found the kettle Claire had always used. He boiled the water and measured the tea as carefully as he remembered watching her do. He waited in complete silence while the leaves slowly released their fragrance. When the tea was ready, he poured a single cup and carried it into his study. He placed it on the same corner of the desk where Claire had faithfully left one almost every evening for years. He did not drink it immediately. Instead, he sat down and stared at the rising steam. Only now did he understand that the warmth had never been the point. Someone had simply wanted him to pause long enough to care for himself. Late that afternoon, Claire returned home earlier than expected after another surgeon volunteered to finish the final rounds. As she stepped inside, she noticed the faint aroma of tea lingering in the hallway. She paused, surprised. Adrian looked up from the dining table. Several business documents lay untouched beside the empty cup. "You're home early," he said quietly. "One of my colleagues covered the last shift," Claire answered. An awkward silence settled between them. It was not hostile, only unfamiliar. Adrian stood slowly. For several seconds, he searched for words that suddenly seemed far more difficult than any negotiation he had ever led. "Claire," he began. She met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried for weeks. "Yes." He lowered his gaze. "I know I've been absent." The sentence felt painfully inadequate the moment it left his mouth. "I've been thinking about that." Claire listened without interrupting. He took a careful breath. "I should have paid more attention." She remained quiet. Her face was gentle but unreadable. Finally, she answered with complete honesty. "Attention isn't something people ask for forever, Adrian. At some point, they simply learn how to live without it." Her words were neither angry nor cruel. They carried only the quiet certainty of someone who had already learned a difficult truth. Adrian felt the weight of them settle deeper than any accusation could have. He wanted to explain. He wanted to defend himself. Instead, he remembered the notebook filled with years of invisible kindness. He realized explanations would only protect the man he had been. They would do nothing for the woman standing in front of him. Claire offered him a small, respectful smile before picking up her hospital bag. "I need to prepare for tomorrow's surgeries," she said softly. "Good night." She walked upstairs at an unhurried pace, leaving Adrian alone beside the cooling teacup once again. This time he did not mistake her silence for forgiveness. Nor did he expect one conversation to mend what months of neglect had quietly broken. As he looked toward the staircase after she disappeared from view, he finally accepted a difficult truth. If he truly wanted another chance, it could not begin with better words. It would have to begin with becoming the kind of man whose actions no longer required them. The days that followed were marked not by dramatic declarations, but by quiet choices that almost no one noticed. Adrian stopped scheduling meetings before 7 o'clock each evening, despite repeated objections from members of his executive team. Ethan noticed the empty time blocks appearing across the chairman's calendar. He simply nodded when Adrian dismissed another request for a late dinner with overseas investors. "Tomorrow morning will be fine," Adrian said calmly. "Tonight belongs somewhere else." It was the first time Ethan had ever heard him protect time that carried no financial value. When Adrian arrived home before sunset, the house was unusually still. Claire was in the backyard, kneeling beside a small flower bed that had been neglected through the colder months. She wore a light sweater over casual clothes, carefully trimming faded branches from a row of lavender plants. Adrian stood quietly for a moment before walking toward her. "Do you need another pair of gloves?" he asked. Claire looked up, surprised by the question itself more than by his presence. "There are extras in the garage," she answered. Without another word, Adrian retrieved a pair and returned. He knelt beside the neighboring flower bed and began clearing away dead leaves. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of branches and distant birds settling into the evening. It was awkward, unfamiliar, and strangely peaceful. After finishing one section, Adrian gathered the discarded branches into a bag and carried them to the curb. Claire noticed that he did not check his phone once. Months ago, every quiet moment had eventually been interrupted by another call or another email demanding his attention. This evening, the phone remained inside his jacket pocket. When the work was finished, Claire brushed the soil from her hands. "Thank you," she said simply. Adrian met her eyes and answered with equal simplicity. "You're welcome." He did not search for praise. He did not mention the conversation from the previous night. The moment ended exactly where it belonged. Later that week, another test arrived without warning. Adrian was preparing for an important video conference with international partners. His assistant informed him that the meeting had been moved forward by an hour. It would now overlap with the annual hospital recognition ceremony, where Claire was receiving an award for outstanding patient care. In previous years, he had always sent flowers with a handwritten note. It explained that business obligations made attendance impossible. His assistant was already drafting the message when Adrian quietly stopped her. "Cancel the conference," he said. She blinked in disbelief. Sir, the board has been preparing for this negotiation for weeks. Adrian adjusted his watch, then lowered his hand before fastening the clasp. They can wait one evening. At Harborview Medical Center, Claire accepted the award with the same humility she brought to every patient room. She thanked her colleagues, praised the nurses who had stood beside her through countless overnight emergencies, and stepped away from the podium to warm applause. As guests gathered afterward, she turned and unexpectedly saw Adrian standing near the back of the auditorium. He had arrived before the ceremony began and had remained quietly out of sight. He was not carrying flowers. There was no photographer beside him, no public speech, and no grand apology. When their eyes met, he smiled gently and applauded with everyone else. Claire walked toward him after greeting several coworkers. "I didn't know you were coming," she admitted. Adrian answered honestly. "Neither did I, until I realized I had already missed too many moments that mattered." The words were soft, free of excuses, and offered without expectation. Claire looked at him for a long moment. The old hurt had not disappeared, and trust had not magically returned. But for the first time since the gala, she saw something different in the man standing before her. He was no longer trying to convince her with promises. He was allowing his priorities to speak before his voice did. They walked toward the parking lot together beneath the cool evening sky, not hand in hand, not yet, but side by side at an unhurried pace. Between them remained the distance created by one painful sentence. Yet this time, Adrian did not try to cross it with another sentence. He simply matched his steps to hers. He quietly accepted that rebuilding a marriage would require the same patience Claire had once given him without ever asking for recognition. Nearly 2 weeks passed after the hospital ceremony. The quiet changes Adrian had begun were no longer isolated moments. They had become habits. He left the office before sunset more often than not. Business dinners were delegated. Weekend conference calls disappeared from his calendar unless they were absolutely unavoidable. His executives adapted with surprising speed. They proved that many of the demands he had once considered impossible to refuse had never truly required his presence. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Ethan entered Adrian's office carrying several urgent documents. They needed immediate approval before an overseas acquisition could move forward. Adrian reviewed the first few pages carefully before his phone vibrated. The screen displayed Claire's name. For a brief second, he simply looked at it. Months earlier, he would have silenced the call and returned it later. This time, he answered immediately. Claire's voice remained composed. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I won't keep you long. You never have to apologize for calling," Adrian replied quietly. There was a brief pause on the other end before she continued. "The hospital's blood donation program is running short tomorrow. A few surgeons are staying after their shifts to help. I just thought you might want to know in case your company still wanted to sponsor the event this year." Adrian glanced toward the unsigned contracts on his desk. Ethan remained standing silently across the room. "What time does it begin?" Adrian asked. Claire sounded almost surprised. 6 o'clock. I'll be there." After the call ended, Ethan looked toward the conference schedule, waiting beside the documents. "The board is expecting you in 20 minutes, he reminded him carefully. Adrian closed the acquisition file without signing it. "Reschedule the meeting," he said. Ethan hesitated. The investors flew in from New York. Adrian stood, adjusted his watch, then lowered his hand before fastening it. "They'll still be here tomorrow. The donation drive won't." Ethan studied him for a moment before quietly gathering the papers. "I'll make the arrangements." The following evening, the hospital lobby filled with volunteers, nurses, physicians, medical students, and members of the community. Adrian arrived without photographers, press releases, or company banners. He rolled up the sleeve of his dress shirt, completed the paperwork, and joined everyone else waiting patiently to donate. Several nurses recognized him only after seeing his name on the registration form. Claire noticed him from across the room while speaking with a patient's family. She watched quietly as he thanked the medical staff, accepted their instructions without special treatment, and took his place at the end of the line. There was no performance in his actions. He simply behaved like another person hoping to help. Later that evening, after the final donors had left, Claire found him helping volunteers stack folding chairs into storage. "You didn't have to stay for this," she said gently. Adrian lifted another chair before answering. "Neither did you," Claire smiled faintly. "It's part of my job." He shook his head no. "Surgery is your job." He looked around the nearly empty lobby, where exhausted volunteers were still cleaning long after their shifts had ended. "This is who you choose to be." His words carried quiet admiration instead of apology. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, uncertain how to respond. Before she could answer, an elderly volunteer accidentally dropped a box of medical supplies near the entrance. Adrian crossed the room immediately, kneeling beside the man to gather scattered packages before helping him back to his feet. Claire watched the exchange from several steps away. Months ago, Adrian would likely have been focused on an urgent phone call, unaware that anything had happened nearby. Tonight, he never reached for his phone once. Driving home together, beneath a light evening rain, neither of them felt the need to fill every silence with conversation. The windshield wipers moved steadily across the glass, while the city lights reflected softly on the wet streets. Claire looked out the window before quietly speaking. "Do you remember what you said that night at the gala?" Adrian's hands remained steady on the steering wheel. "Every day," he answered honestly. She nodded without anger. "So do I." The words settled gently between them, not reopening the wound, but acknowledging that it still existed. Adrian did not rush to defend himself or ask whether she had forgiven him. Instead, he continued driving through the rain in silence. He understood at last that healing did not mean pretending the past had never happened. It meant having the courage to face it together, one truthful moment at a time. Autumn settled gently over Seattle, painting the city with muted gold and quiet rain. And so for the first time in years, Adrian no longer measured his days only by contracts signed or meetings completed. He measured them by whether he had been present. The change remained imperfect, but it was real. Then, one Monday afternoon, the past quietly returned to test him. His executive board gathered around the conference table with tense expressions. An unexpected security crisis involving one of the company's international facilities demanded immediate leadership. Several directors insisted Adrian board the next flight that evening. The timing could not have been worse. Claire had been invited to deliver the keynote address at a regional medical conference the following morning. It was an event she had spent months preparing for, but had mentioned only once, almost in passing. She had long ago stopped expecting him to rearrange his life for hers. Ethan reviewed the travel schedule before looking toward Adrian. "If you leave within the hour, you'll arrive before the emergency meeting begins overseas." The room fell silent. Months earlier, Adrian would already have been on his way to the airport. He looked through the conference room window at the rain drifting across the city skyline. Without speaking, he removed his watch and placed it carefully on the polished table in front of him. The familiar gesture caught Ethan's attention immediately. Adrian slowly closed the travel folder. "Assign Daniel to lead the international response," he said calmly. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. "Sir," one director protested, "the client specifically requested you." Adrian nodded. "Daniel has been preparing for this responsibility for 3 years. If I truly trust the people I lead, then I need to let them lead." Another executive leaned forward. "This decision carries significant financial risk." Adrian met his eyes without raising his voice. "Some risks cost money. Others cost the people waiting for you to keep your word." No one argued again. Early the next morning, he arrived at the medical conference before the auditorium doors opened. He chose a seat near the back, just as he had during Claire's hospital ceremony. When she stepped onto the stage, she looked across the audience while greeting the attendees. Her eyes paused for only a moment before finding him. She did not falter, but something softened inside her expression. Claire spoke about resilience in medicine, about teamwork, and about the quiet responsibility of remaining beside people during the most difficult moments of their lives. Healing, she told the audience, is rarely created by one extraordinary act. More often, it is built through ordinary acts repeated with consistency and care. Adrian listened without taking a single note, because every word seemed written directly into the months they had just lived together. After the applause faded and the audience slowly dispersed, Claire found him waiting outside. He stood beneath the covered entrance as light rain drifted across the parking lot. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Adrian looked at her with complete honesty. That night at the gala, I said that if love were real, I would have chosen someone else. He paused, allowing the painful sentence to exist exactly as it had. I was wrong. He did not rush forward. He did not ask for forgiveness. The truth is, his voice grew quieter. Love was standing beside me all along. I was simply too proud to recognize it. Claire lowered her eyes, remembering every silent evening. She remembered every untouched cup of tea, and every ordinary kindness that had slowly disappeared after those words. When she looked back at him, there were tears in her eyes, but they were no longer born from fresh hurt. They came from seeing the difference between regrets spoken and regret lived. I can't erase what happened, Adrian continued, and I don't expect you to pretend it never happened. But every choice I've made since then has been my answer to that sentence. Not because I deserve another chance, but because you deserved a better husband long before I realized it. The rain continued falling softly around them. Claire stepped closer until only a small space remained between them. She reached for his hand, not with certainty that every wound had healed, but with quiet confidence. The man before her was no longer hiding behind the one who had spoken so carelessly months before. Their fingers intertwined for the first time since the gala. No audience applauded. No dramatic music filled the air. There was only the gentle sound of rain and two people standing together beneath a gray Seattle sky. There was the quiet understanding that trust had not returned because of one heartfelt apology. It had returned because every ordinary day since then had slowly taught the same truth that words alone never could.